So our second segment is folk psychology and the brain. How are the mental states of folk psychology related to the brain? And this is a first pass because we'll return to cognitive neuroscience later. But the essential question here is what might be called the mind-body problem. How are the mental states that we ordinarily think about in everyday life, how are they related to the brain? So I'll go through three basic options. There's lots of variations on these themes, a lot more subtleties and nuances, but I think these sort of capture three important trends in terms of how we should think about the relation between beliefs, desires, and so forth, and the brain. So the first one is called eliminativism, and it's usually associated with Paul Churchland and Patricia Churchland, who have worked closely together for decades. So on that view, right, folk psychology hypothesizes that there are beliefs, that there are desires, there are intentions, all these mental states. It hypothesizes these to explain behavior, but it's a failure as a theory, right? So we should reject the theory, and then we should deny that there are beliefs, desires, and so forth. In other words, there's just the brain, right? And the analogy here is to a construct in physics, physical chemistry. It was called phlogiston. The idea was in the 18th century or 19th century, we didn't understand combustion, burning. And so it was hypothesized that when items burned, they let off a sort of a clear, colorless gas of some sort, a substance called phlogiston, right? And it turned out that this theory was false. We don't talk about phlogiston today because there isn't any, right? And why isn't there any? Because, well, our best theories say there's no reason to think that there is any sort of substance called phlogiston. And so what the Churchlands argue is similarly with folk psychology, sure, we talk about beliefs and desires and all these sort of mental states, but it's a failed theory, right? It really doesn't explain and predict our behavior as well as we think it does, and so we should just abandon it and therefore abandon all talk of beliefs and desires, right? And we eliminate this in favor of some sort of a neural vocabulary instead. So that's the first option. The second option is realism, also called intentional realism for purposes we don't need to get into. And this is kind of the opposite, right? The idea here is that beliefs and desires and so on are causally efficacious mental states that successfully, largely successfully, do explain a great deal of our behavior. And on this case, in this sense, they are what you might say realized in brain states, but they're not identical to them. And that can be a little bit confusing, but if you think by analogy of a song, right, there's a performance of the song, but the song itself is not identical to the performance, right? It is realized in that performance, but it is not identical to that performance. And in a somewhat similar way, you can think of a belief as something that is realized in some way in my brain state, in your brain states, whatever, but they aren't identical to them, right? So there's a lot more metaphysical stuff going on there, but the basic idea is that beliefs can be mapped in some way to brain states. And the third view is called quasi-realism, following Daniel Dennett, who holds that, well, you know, they're real, but they're not brain states, right? They're more like real patterns of behavior that we can see in relation to a system's goals, right? And this is where the triangles and circles that we saw earlier in that short little video, right? When we watch the triangle and the circle and the little triangle moving around, right, what we're seeing is certain sorts of behavior moving around. And we start ascribing to those shapes various mental states, right? But there's nothing more to the mental states on this view than the patterns of behavior that we actually observe. And in this view, there's a very important complication, which we won't be able to get into, which is the idea that this view, unlike the other two, has a far wider scope than just the systems we usually think of as having beliefs and desires. So, for example, it includes the shapes that we saw in the video, right? They have beliefs and desires in this sense, right? Whereas the eliminativist, Paul Churchland, or the realist, Jerry Fodor, they would not have beliefs or desires, right? They don't have brains, for one thing. Okay. So 3 basic options. And the question is, all of them have their pros, all of them have their cons, but they're kind of where we start with when we start thinking about the relation between folk psychology and the brain. Either there are no such thing, right? We just look at the brain, or we're looking at the brain and there really are beliefs and desires and so forth, or we're kind of off track and we should really be just looking at patterns of behavior, and really the brain doesn't really have a lot to do with it except as some sort of an underlying mechanism. So where do we stand, right? Well, it's not clear at this point, within the philosophical, psychological discussion, which of these options is best, right? And as I said, most of them have various nuances and, arguments for and against, and it's still an open question, right? And from a neuroscientific point of view, what we're finding in neuroscience actually complicates this issue a lot, right? And we'll get to that in the 4th segment. But first, I think it's important to see why it matters which of these 3 options turns out to be the one that we think is best, right? I mean, again, there are lots of options here, but why would it matter? So that's our next segment.